All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clint Sprauve. I am with Sauce Labs, and I'm here to talk to you about continuous testing strategies for mobile. So I want to be able to basically open this up to make it to where you can get a feel for just understanding continuous testing and mobile testing as well. What I found, though, as I work with various customers, they find that just trying to test on mobile, let alone continuous testing, is very difficult and very challenging, right? Especially if you have different types of applications and platforms that you have to support. So my goal today is to really kind of demystify and actually help simplify what mobile testing means from a continuous testing perspective. All right, and so if you have any questions, definitely jot them down and hold them to the end, but we'll definitely answer all your questions as quickly as possible, okay? So first of all, one of the things we're finding is that digital experience drives growth. So as you can see from this particular screen, 47% of companies are experiencing pressure from the board of directors to make some sort of digital transformation. And most of you are probably going through this in your own organization where they're saying, look, we need to modernize how we develop our applications, how quickly we can get them out, right? And so it's becoming imperative, not just at the dev level, but actually at the C level in terms of implementing some sort of digital transformation, right? Because in today's, and you guys have probably heard this cliche, depending on what conferences you've been to, is that every company is a technology company, right? Everyone's doing something with technology. If you're, Lyft or Uber, they're a technology company versus a ride-sharing service, right? So they're technology first. So what you're seeing is that this is really pushing the growth for a lot of organizations. So there are three key ingredients for actually winning in this digital transformation. So one is speed to market. How quickly can you release your application? And in this example, it talks about Amazon, where they release an update every 11.6 seconds. Now that's a lot. And that's a lot for a lot of organizations that are trying to go through this transformation, right? And if you look at the other areas, customer experience and mobile. For customer experience, 79% of users will retry an app only once before abandoning it if it doesn't work. And I'm the same way. I'm going to give you an example. So there's this app that's used at my kids' school. It's called Class Dojo. And what it does, it basically allows the teacher to provide information on your child throughout the day, whether they've been acting up, whether they've done something great. So when they do something great, they get a positive dojo. When they do something bad, they get a negative dojo. So I have an iPhone 7, right? And my wife has the Samsung Galaxy 8. So one day I'm at work, I receive a dojo, which is basically some sort of alert, and it says, and my son's name is Clint as well. It says, well, Clint did so-and-so, and it just stopped abruptly. So I was like, well, I can't see the rest of the text. So I flip it, and I was like, it didn't adjust. I can't do anything with the text. It's just there. So I asked my wife. I said, hey, bring this up on your S8. So she said, oh, yeah. She says, oh, yeah. So apparently Clinton got in trouble for talking too much during morning math. And I was like, how are you seeing all that? And she said, I'm seeing it like that. I said, well, can you turn yours, landscape? So she flips it, everything pops up. I'm like, okay, I've got an iPhone 7. Come on now, this is crazy. So what I do, and I rarely do this, how many of you ever tried to get tech support for a mobile app from the App Store? Just a show of hands, have any of you? You have. Okay, so you probably know my experience. So this is interesting. If you thought just getting tech support in general was difficult for a web app, trying it for a mobile app in the App Store. So I was able to go online, find their support email address, email the person, and they actually got back to me fairly quick. And I put in the issue, what the problem was. They responded to me. Can you send me a screenshot of your issue? I'm like, well, doesn't really help because I can't put it in landscape mode, so I can't really screenshot that, right? But I can tell you that my text is getting cut off, so I sent one anyway. They respond, have you tried uninstalling and reinstalling the app? So I'm thinking this is like, what's the phrase, deja vu all over again, right? It works on my machine, so then I said, well, I don't really want to do that, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. I reinstall the app, then they come back to me about maybe a few hours later saying, this is actually a bug on with iOS version blah, 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 and also a problem on the iPhone 7. And I'm thinking like, this is crazy. I went through all of this just to find out that it doesn't work, right? And so it brings me to that third point right there, right? More than 50% of the world's traffic comes from mobile devices. If you're like me nowadays, when I look up a particular website, or if I'm trying to find out something, I don't necessarily go to my laptop anymore. I'm going to bring up my mobile device, go to the mobile web. I'm either going to use Safari or the mobile Chrome browser to figure out, or get the information that I'm looking for. So this is actually becoming the trend. People are going to their tablets or their mobile devices. So as you know, and this is the problem that the company that developed Clash Dojo is having. They're experiencing these challenges just like we all are, right? And they're real. So you've got these three core areas of device fragmentation. You got various app types. You've got geographically dispersed users, right? So these challenges make testing on mobile very difficult, right? So now we talk about, okay, we have to move to mobile. We have to do this transition. But now we're looking at all these different difficulties in terms of things that we're trying to make right. So companies that get it right are actually doing these things right here, where they focus on innovation, right? And some of these other items. Now at the bottom, you see a list of companies that we talk about that are doing it right. Now, if you notice, there's a mix of companies. You got kind of like the old school legacy companies like the Walmarts and the USAAs of the world. Then you got what typically in the tech world they call like the quote unquote unicorns, like your Twillos and Slacks, right? Your kind of modern web tech companies, right? But they all have things in common. So for example, USAA, they're very innovative with their tech and how they approach development, how they approach software development. And so in order for you to really have a really good, strong mobile testing strategy, especially when it comes to continuous testing, these are the core areas that we have to focus on, right? And this is not done in isolation. This really has to be a buy-in from senior level management in order for this to be implemented throughout the company. So it actually has to be implemented as part of the culture. But however, there are things that you can do as well to help get this right. So let's talk about that journey toward continuous testing from a mobile perspective. So your mobile strategy must answer these key questions. So for example, understand your organization. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as teams start to actually go through this DevOps transformation, right, or trying to implement continuous testing, a lot of times they don't really look at the organization itself. There are some organizations where QA, of course, is still separate. And there's been this sort of thing where folks are saying, well, we should make the developers do all the testing, or we're trying to move testing into the development arena, right? So they're trying to make it more difficult for a lot of the testers. So one of the things that's really been pushed is that they're saying testers now need to learn how to code. I don't necessarily believe that's the right approach. I think it's more of really understanding your organization's, your skill sets, and what you have in your organization in order to make you successful with test automation. So understand your structure, your dev methodology, and your team skill sets. Emulators, simulators, and real devices, which ones and how much of each? And we'll get into that in depth in the rest of the presentation. But this has been also another important topic that many of you have probably heard about. Which automation frameworks should be used? We'll talk about that. And also, should I build a device lab or should I purchase a service? All right. So let's talk about this journey. Now, many of you probably fall somewhere along this line. So at Sauce Labs, what we do is we try to walk customers through where they are in that journey from a consultative perspective. Where are you? So we can understand how you can get to that next level. And these are some of the things that you can do, regardless. So you need to look at, the types of applications you're testing. Of course, your legacy application, if you're beginning automation, or if you're doing intermediate automation. So this will let you know where do you fall in that actual structure, right? So the organization, process, your testing strategy, as well as your mobile strategy. So if we look at this, we talked about, understanding your organization, understanding those team skill sets. Where are you from a maturity standpoint? So again, we have to look at the methodology, the management goals, and the organizational structure, right? So if you look at these areas, it'll kind of give you an idea of where you and your organization may fall in terms of how you begin to build this, right? And again, this is very important. And the reason I stress this is because a lot of organizations that I've worked with in the past, they haven't really figured out how do I best utilize my team structure. I've got a team of business analysts. They understand the business, they know it like the back of their hand. I need to be able to utilize those folks so that we can get the most out of our testing. I don't necessarily need to push them to automation unless that's an area they want to grow, right? But I need to be able to utilize them. I've got some test automation engineers that may have used the old HPE tools or the old Silk tools or Ranorex or some of those products, right? How can I transition them to using some of the open source tools, like Selenium or like using Appium or some of the other open source frameworks, right? And really understanding that to where you can get to that level of continuous testing. And so if we look at some of the attributes of those companies that are doing continuous testing, these are some of the things that they're doing. A fully automated agile dev process, right? And from a management perspective, they want to transition completely, but they need to add new app teams or business units, right? And then for the organizational structure, some of them have QA merged into dev. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that in that way, but you need to find a way to make sure that there's that level of continuity between QA and dev directly. So where do you start? Where do you begin on this continuous testing journey? So let's look at the mobile testing strategy. So typically, if you're beginning automation, it's going to be that manual testing that you're doing pretty much at your desk on your laptop, right? And you're doing, maybe real devices connected directly to the computer, and you're doing things locally, or you may have, your own local machines with those devices connect to it. Then you may have the intermediate automation where you have a device farm. You're utilizing a device farm service, like something that Sauce Labs provides, or even Amazon AWS. When you get to that continuous testing effort, it's going to require that you use a combination, and we'll talk about this as well, of emulators, simulators, and real devices. Now, the reason I stress this, and you'll find out a little bit later in terms of what this means from not only an execution perspective, but also from a cost perspective for your organization. And then also, the bottom talks about the build pipeline. So real quick, how many of you are implementing some sort of DevOps methodology within your organization? Okay. And I'm assuming just the majority of you are probably already implementing agile methods as well, right? Okay. How many of you feel you are successful in your current DevOps methodology today? I feel comfortable. Okay. All right. You say it so, right? Yeah, no, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, right? So if you kind of take these individual steps, you'll end up getting there to a point where you can be successful with your continuous testing strategy. All right, so the next area, what devices should I test? All right, so this is just a quick question for anyone in the room, whoever wants to answer or raise their hand. What devices do you think you should test? The latest and the greatest? Or the ones that are currently in the market? Which one do you think?
Major population using it.
Major population using it, okay, that's one answer. You want to test what's coming up. So, right, so if the iPhone 10 that was just released, back beta. Okay. Anyone else? Highest percentage of use. Like the top devices in a particular region, right? Okay, good. You all are correct, right? So it really comes down to it depends, right? And the reason I say that is that when you develop your mobile apps, right, it requires a level of research. So I lead the product marketing for our mobile product. So a lot of times I get asked by customers as well as our sales reps, hey, we've got this new mobile initiative. What devices should I test on? What operating system should I test on? And again, it's going to come down to what type of application are you developing, and who is your customer, right? Who is your end user? Where are they located, right? So this plays a very important part. What this graph is showing you here is iOS distribution and iOS market share, right? So of course, iOS 11, that's a no-brainer. That's going to be the most popular mobile device or mobile operating system that you should be testing. But what we're seeing now is that a majority of these companies aren't necessarily upgrading as fast as they used to. So they've actually slowed down the amount of upgrades that they've done. So you actually, even though you may see that level of usage, there are still some usage worldwide where they're using older operating systems on older devices. So you have to look and research this data, especially for your application, and where the majority of you, or where all of your users are coming from to be able to make this determination. Same thing for Android in the Android distribution market. We talked about device fragmentation. And this data is coming from a site called Apptelligent. So you can go out there and grab that information as well. So you go to apptelligent.com, it's going to give you this direct data. Right? So as you're building your strategy in terms of understanding what devices, what operating systems I should test, this is going to be critical to that strategy. Now, someone talked about what is the percentage of usage in a certain region, right? Active use. So these are the top 10 smartphones in 2017. Hopefully you all can see this graph pretty good. So the top 10 models from the top ranking low-end models, mid-end to high-end, right? Across the board. So you may find that in a certain region, you may have a specific type of OEM model. Oops. You may have a specific type of OEM model that's very popular that you need to test. So you may need to add that to your testing arsenal, right? So what you want to do is really understand the usage, not only of your end users, but the popular devices that this app would actually run on. And also within your organization, depending on when you started developing this application, what operating system or what devices are they initially going to start on? Are they going to start typically on a iOS device, or are they going to start on Android, or both? Here's another interesting stat from a company called Device Atlas, right? So this is about tablet versus smartphone usage, right? So when you're thinking about this, okay, testing mobile is not just about the smartphone itself. There are other mobile devices, such as your various tablets, right? Your Fire TV, your iPads and so forth. So here's an interesting stat. The tablets are least used in India, 2%, and most used in France, 16.9%, right? So you can see the number of countries actually using these types of devices. So now, again, as you're planning, and you can see where I'm going with this, as you get this information, you can now start to build a realistic plan around how you want to do testing and what you need to test. Okay? All right, so continuous testing for mobile apps. Different needs require different solutions, right? So you've probably been seeing this pyramid for God knows how many years, right? So this one kind of takes the approach of more of looking at emulators, simulators, and real devices. So one of the controversies in the industry today is that if you're not testing on a real device, you're not testing at all. How many of you believe that, actually? It's okay if you do. It's not a problem, right? I won't shame you and all that good stuff. But it's actually, when you think about continuous testing, right, and how difficult continuous testing can be and all the planning that needs to go into it, right, and the amount of testing that needs to be done. If you're looking at it from a mobile perspective, you need to have consistency when you're building that continuous testing strategy, especially for test automation, right? You need to be able to scale your mobile testing across all these different devices or all these different operating systems, right? If you choose a real device only perspective, you're going to cut yourself short, right? Because it's going to be harder to shift left with real devices only. So if you think about what an emulator or simulator is, right? Because it's spun up within the VM. It's actually the software. So I can create my test automation with these VMs and be able to test for those items that aren't as critical to the device, but more toward the application. So you want to have a proper mix of both, right? So now you're able to do the shift testing left and test as early in the software development lifecycle as possible. So there may be some things that you're testing on that application that have nothing to do with the actual physical device itself, but more about the application. When you need to get into testing some of the more physical device attributes, whether, unlocking the device, Bluetooth, any other features, the battery life and how it affects. What happens when you go from 4G to 3G to losing a connection or switching to Wi-Fi, right? Going through all these different scenarios. So you want to have a good mix. So use real devices when you need to be able to make sure that when that new device is released, that you'll be able to support it. If you have, custom and OS browser, pixel perfect display testing, and you use emulators and simulators when you need to do massive parallel testing. So any of you that are doing any type of web testing, you want to be able to test in parallel, right? Because parallel testing is going to give you more bang for your buck. You're going to be able to do more testing in less time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what we typically recommend is that a customer has a good mix of real devices, emulators and simulators, especially if you're trying to implement continuous testing. Another reason to think about this is think about the cost. Earlier, I showed a slide of kind of the companies that are doing it right. Think about, a large retail company that has, a lot of resources and dollars at their disposal. They can create a continuous testing lab of 50, 75, 100 devices, right? Can you imagine how much that would cost your organization if you tried to procure that many devices for test automation in parallel, continuously, right? It can become very expensive. So emulators and simulators can help, supplement or augment those costs, right? Then you have to look at private or public cloud. What's going to be allowed in your organization? Public devices are going to be easier to access, but you may need to test on a private cloud. Like I talked about before, depending on the regions that you're covering, there may be a specific device in EMEA or APJ that you need to procure that's only for this particular customer, right? Or this particular region. You may need to have that in your data center, right? Or you may have privacy issues and concerns. So security may be a big concern. We work with a lot of financial institutions, so they have a private cloud option, right? So mobile test automation frameworks. How many of you are actually doing mobile testing today? How many of you are doing automation as well? All right. Who's using, and I'm just going to go through. Appium, raise your hand. Okay. Espresso. XCUITest. Robotium. There's so many different frameworks out there, right? So why you want to use automation framework? Why should you use an automation framework? Well, it's going to actually help you. I'm not sure why that's not displaying correctly. That's weird. You want to be able to, just like with a test automation solution, you want to be able to simplify and be able to have an easier way of implementing your test automation strategy, right? So there are different frameworks that best suit different organizations. Again, when we go back to that list of the things that you need to consider, we talked about understanding your organization and your skill set. A lot of these frameworks were built for certain types of individuals or certain types of testers based upon that skill set. So for example, if we look at Appium, Appium is one of the more popular open source test automation for mobile app development, mobile app testing. So typically, Appium, of course, was derived from Selenium. So if you have that Selenium skill set, or if you work with some of the legacy test tools, it's going to be a much easier transition. So Appium's much more popular with those that have that Selenium background, that Selenium skill set. Doesn't mean that you can't use the other ones or those skills aren't transferable, but typically with the customers that we work with, the ones that have come from the Selenium world or the traditional test automation world, is an easier transition for them for Appium. Now, some of the advantages of Appium, of course, automating native, web, and hybrid mobile apps. You can test on real devices, emulators and simulators, be able to use those same tests that you developed on the emulators and simulators and be able to push those onto the real devices, right? And you can use any language that Selenium supports. And then also, the key advantage, in my opinion, is you have a single framework for both iOS and Android devices, right? So it kind of helps with that learning curve. Now, what is Espresso? Espresso is a framework that's typically used by those that are doing Android development, right? So if you think Google, those that are doing Android development, this is one that's developed out of Google. So what you're going to see is this is more of a developer-led or developer push. So if you've had pushback from your R&D guys and your developers that say, look, we don't want to use Appium, we want to use Espresso, right? Because they're comfortable with it. It's a very simple framework that they can implement fairly quickly, right? And they're developers, so they're the ones that are going to usually push something like Espresso. But Espresso is a really good framework, one, because it's super fast and reliable. right? And they have backwards compatibility, and it's very, very easy to use from a developer's perspective. It also has automatic synchronization. So there are a lot of advantages. So when you're looking at what framework you're going to use, you want to look at that as well. Again, organizational structure, what is the skill set, what's most advantageous to you and your team, and the amount of development that you're doing on Android as well as iOS. Next, XCUITest. This actually ships with Xcode. So again, those developers that are developing on iOS, this is what they're going to prefer. This is what they're going to push. Again, a very, it ships with Xcode. So the advantages, again, super fast and reliable. And of course, it's controlled by Apple and Xcode dev team. So the closer that you can get with that framework to the actual company that's developing these operating systems and these apps, you're going to have a key advantage, right? So again, it's not that one framework is better than the other. It's really going to depend, one, on your organization and what their skill set is. Mobile device labs, build versus buy. How many of you are running your own device lab today or have your own devices in-house that you're testing? Okay. How many of you are using a third-party service? Okay. All right. So why not build your own mobile grid or a mobile test lab? Well, one, it can be a maintenance nightmare, right? And we'll talk about it. There really isn't a wrong answer. You can do both, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But some of the biggest headaches or disadvantages is, one, you have to constantly update the browsers, the operating systems, and things of that nature, frameworks, and the devices, and trying to maintain those devices as well. And it can be costly in terms of people and time. Right? So you need to be able to maintain these devices, make sure if there's any devices that you need to decommission, replace them, and so forth. Most internal teams will, cut corners to reduce burdens for, limited coverage, limited scale, limited updates, right? And sometimes it can be very unreliable, right? Because what ends up happening, you'll spend most of your time trying to maintain this device lab internally and maintaining these devices. Then it becomes more costly for your team and your organization. So you want to be able to prevent false failure expense, right? So you want to be able to remove that level of complexity, right? Be able to offload some of that. We have some customers that actually do a little bit of both. They use a third-party service like ours to be able to, test against real devices, emulators, and simulators. But they also have some things specifically within their organization. And part of it is an organizational security thing, or they're working on something proprietary that they just don't want to try to build out with a third-party service. So they'll do a combination of both. They'll say, these particular devices we're going to work with and test in-house, but for everything else, we're going to use the third-party service, right? So they're kind of augmenting those services. So you can do both. So you don't have to do 100% of either or the other. Again, assess your organization, what your needs are, and how you need to test it. Parallel test execution, and this is huge. This goes back to the whole mantra of continuous testing. In order to really get the full effects of continuous testing, you need to be able to test as much as possible in a shorter time frame. So just an example of what we mean by parallel execution, if we look at this scenario, you want to be able to scale your testing platform as much as possible. And this is where our relationship with Tricentis comes in. So using something like Tosca and Sauce Labs, or just even a third-party service, what you can do is be able to take those tests and be able to scale them. So instead of you trying to build out that information or those tests, you can now execute them in parallel. So if you look at this example, if you do serial testing, this is a hypothetical example of a test that's taking 9 minutes. And theoretically, if you run those same tests against those different devices, you can run them in parallel and execute them in a much shorter time frame, right? And these are just estimates, depending on the type of application that you're testing. So you want to do as much parallel execution as possible, especially from a continuous testing standpoint. And if you haven't seen in the demonstrations, if you go to the Tricentis booth or the Sauce Labs booth, you can kind of see this in action in terms of how that actually works. So what I'm showing here is when we talk about the whole build versus buy thing, this is kind of just a snapshot. And you have to kind of lay out in terms of what we do. We do what's called a business value assessment, where we go through a list of criteria for various customers. This is something that you can create on your own as well. What that means is you want to find out what, if we're going to build this lab, if we're going to keep everything in-house, or we're going to try and work with a third party, what is going to be our initial cost? What are the things that we need to look for, right? The number of full-time employees, who's going to maintain these devices, who's going to be able to create this, the number of teams that are going to be using devices and so forth, the amount of automation, the number of tests you're going to have per year, right? The number of builds, test cases, right? So you have to look at the actual cost, the cost of the servers, the cost of the devices, the number of devices that you want to support, and things of that nature. So what this is going to do is going to give you really a good estimate in terms of what that cost is going to be. So you really have to kind of break this down in terms of understanding, if we're going to take this on, what is this going to cost my organization? Is this going to reduce the number of headcount that we have on our team? Is this going to require additional headcount? Is there going to be a full-time person that's going to maintain all of this for us? Right? So you have to look at all these different factors, because if you don't, then you won't be able to have a strong continuous testing implementation. Right? So these are just some other costs that that you can kind of estimate. So we use this when we're working with customers to kind of just plug in some of the numbers so that they can get an idea in terms of how much is this actually going to cost us to maintain it. And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer if you do want to build your own lab, but if you go through this exercise, it's going to help you understand what that cost is going to be and how it's going to affect your organization, right? What's our release schedule, right? What are pressures coming down to release these applications that trying to implement something like this might affect how we were able to do our testing. All right, so I'll just kind of skip through this piece. But it'll give you kind of just a really good estimate in terms of understanding what your total costs are going to be and the savings that you can have either by using a third party or what you can do in terms of doing it in-house. So just a quick recap. One, make sure you understand your organization, your structure. Emulators, simulators, and real devices, and I can't stress this enough, if you are building a continuous testing strategy, you've got to include emulators and simulators, right? If you want to have that level of robust, repeatable test cases and reduce the amount of dependencies. Because again, you don't want QA to be the bottleneck with just real devices only, right? So limit that amount of risk. Choose automated frameworks that best fit your team. You may use one or you may even use a couple that's right for you and your team, your organization, whichever one best fits them. And I've seen organizations kind of interchange frameworks. They'll try one, it doesn't work, they'll switch to another. Determine your build or buy strategy. What's going to work, right? What other pieces do you need to integrate with? What's going to be that cost? How much is that going to cost your organization? Look at it from a realistic perspective. Once you do that, then you'll be able to truly implement a mobile testing strategy that's going to work for your organization. And with that, any questions? No questions. You guys ready to party already? Not one question. I might even have a prize for somebody with a great question. I don't actually, but since your hand's up, I got you. I caught you. Go ahead. Now you have to ask.
So, with the integration of Tosca and Sauce Labs, I've seen the iOS and Android devices. Does it also support the different OS and browser combinations?
Yes, yes. So the question was, he's seen the different Android and iOS devices. Does it support the different browser and OS combinations? And the answer is yes. The reason being is that what we have to do is, you have a lot of companies out there, you may be one of them that's doing applications for responsive design, meaning you need to make sure it works on the website as well as that mobile device. So how does it work when you bring up that on a Microsoft Edge browser? What does that look like when it's on Chrome on a mobile device, or on Safari on that mobile device? So. Yes.
Are those available in the private cloud and public cloud?
Yes.
Different pricing for those in each cloud, or are they the same?
It's different, yeah, because you're talking about VMs versus actual devices, so it's going to be slightly different. But there's a
VMs
Oh, they can be either or.
But are they the same cost? Or is it-
Yes. Well, no, the private cloud is going to cost more because one, you've got a different, you've got a dedicated server or number of VMs specifically for your organization. Any other questions?
And this is all mobile, right, for right now?
It's mobile as well as cross-browser.
So you can use Tricentis on Sauce Labs?
Yes, you can use it for both.
For
Yeah.
Selenium testing, but desktop cross-browser you can, but not the Tosca. Yeah, there's an integration with Tosca to point to third-party cloud like Sauce Labs and run Selenium tests in the cloud.
But not the Tosca, traditional Tosca.
Not traditional, that's right.
Right. Yes. I'm sorry.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yep, that is coming. Yeah. Gotcha. That I don't know. Let me double check with our R&D guys.
Thought that was going very soon.
It's coming.
It's
Right
coming.
around.
Yeah,
very-
it's
very soon.
it's extremely soon. So, all right. Any other questions, comments? All right. No other questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Just a very sort of dumb question.
And-
What's your relationship with the mobile vendors? I mean, how do you get those bigger versions? How do you get access to their technology?
Right. So the question is, what is our relationship with those mobile vendors? So what we do, we make sure that, we try to make sure that we keep up with everything that's going on. So we try to make sure that we can provide or procure those devices as soon as they come out, right? So we basically, try to develop those relationships. For example, we do like real network connectivity. We have a relationship with T-Mobile, so you can actually test against an actual device. So what we try to do is develop those close relationships and be able to make sure that we can, procure those devices as quickly as possible and get them in our data center. So we try to have as close a relationship with those vendors as possible. Yep. Yes, sir.
How many real devices do you have?
We have thousands of real devices, right? So what we do is the moment that new device is released, we try to make sure we have it in our data centers that same day. If not within that same day, within a day or two. But most likely, we definitely always try to have it within the day that it's actually released and put it in our data center.
Follow-up question. The
Yep.
reason why I ask is because with real devices, especially, there tends to be like a lag time versus VMs.
Mm-hmm.
And so, has there ever been a situation where it would be like a bottleneck because a lot of your customers are using it like at one time, and then there's a huge bottleneck? And if there is, what is like the typical like lag time if there is?
Gotcha. Yeah, and so let me repeat the question now. I'll kind of paraphrase. Let me know if I don't paraphrase it correctly. So the thing is, like, he was talking about the difference between using a real device versus emulators and simulators. He's saying real devices typically sometimes have that lag, right? And what if you have multiple users that need to access that same device, all right? That's a very good question because we actually talked about this morning with our team. So typically the real device can be pretty fast. So it's going to vary, depending on the type of application you have and how quickly that device is going to boot. So you can, and the way that we control that is we have what's called dynamic device allocation, right? So if someone's using that device and they stop using it or it's open, then someone else can actually procure that device. So we don't lock a device down for an individual user. So we can reallocate that. So we have dynamic device allocation. And we have, of course, if you're using, especially the public cloud, we're gonna have multiple devices in various regions, in the US and EMEA. So we can work through that. And if there is lag time, we need to understand what's causing that lag time. Is it from a manual testing perspective or is it an automation perspective? Because if it's automation, it could be something in the automation script, right? It could be that you're making way too many calls, maybe some unnecessary calls, right? You may have too many waits within your test script itself. So we kind of look at it, we try to step back and take a holistic approach to it and understand, okay, not only what devices are you testing, how are you implementing that test automation? And we've been doing this for a long time, so we optimize how those devices are within our cloud. Same thing with our VMs and when we spin them up. So did that answer your question? Yeah. Right.
Never had demand exceed supply.
I'm sorry, say again?
Never had demand exceed supply.
I think
Go ahead.
I think your question few of each in the public cloud. So at some point, if you want a device, and you want the device, and I want the device, and if there's only 2 devices, someone will have to wait that period of time. And that's
Yeah.
one of the reasons people go to private clouds. Because in a private cloud, you can have 5, 6, 8 devices that are dedicated just to your organization, and you control the access to them. So oftentimes there wouldn't be a wait.
Yeah, and
Cloud, because they're serving such a large audience, sometimes there is.
And that's the crux difference, because now I have meeting access.
Exactly.
right, exactly.
In the private cloud, you can turn over a device a couple times a year and lots of other SLAs and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And typically, again, it's going to depend on the popularity of the device that's being used within that public cloud as well.
Yeah, if you want to test an iPhone 5, it's all yours.
Yeah, yeah, right. Even to a certain extent, yeah, iPhone 10 as well. So, all right, so we have. I can stick around and answer as many questions as you need. I got my colleagues here as well. So, thank you. Appreciate your time.